Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of Harlan County, Kentucky. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. In the winter of 1933, the town of Lynch in Harlan County, Kentucky became the epicenter of what local newspapers would later call the Hollow Incident. To outsiders, this coal mining community nestled in the Appalachian Mountains seemed like any other struggling town during the Great Depression. But beneath the soot-covered facades of company houses and the rhythmic sounds of pickaxes against coal, something far more insidious was brewing. The case began with the disappearance of Dr. William Thornton, the town's only physician who had served the community for over 15 years. According to police reports filed on January 23, 1933, Dr. Thornton failed to arrive at the clinic that morning. This was particularly unusual as 3 miners had been injured in a minor cave-in the previous night, and the doctor was expected to check on their condition. What makes this case particularly disturbing is not just the disappearance itself, but the collective silence that followed. When Sheriff James McAllister questioned the townspeople, he noted in his report, "Not a single soul appeared concerned. The miners stared at me with empty eyes. Mrs. Thornton herself seemed relieved rather than worried. How does a man who treated thousands of patients, delivered countless babies, and was the only source of medical care for miles, vanish without causing alarm?" This is where our story begins. The early 1930s in Appalachia were marked by extreme hardship. The coal industry was in decline, leaving many without work. Those who managed to keep their jobs at United States Coal and Coke Company's Mine No. 31 in Lynch worked in increasingly dangerous conditions as safety measures were reduced to cut costs. Lynch itself was a town built entirely around the mine. Established in 1917 by U.S. Coal and Coke, a subsidiary of U.S. Steel, it was named after the company's president, Thomas Lynch. At its peak in the late 1920s, it had a population of nearly 10,000, making it one of the largest coal mining communities in the country. The town was designed with efficiency in mind. Rows of identical houses arranged in a grid pattern, all within walking distance of the mine entrance. The company controlled every aspect of life, from the community facilities to the church to the company store, where miners were obligated to shop. This level of control created a unique social dynamic. As one former resident described it in a 1975 oral history, "In Lynch, you didn't just work for the company, you lived inside it. It sits separated from the main town by a stretch of dense forest and a small creek that locals called Whisper Stream." According to county records, the doctor had purchased this property in 1918 upon arriving in Lynch, specifically requesting isolation for what he called the peace required for medical research. The house itself was unusual for the area, a 2-story Victorian structure with a basement and attic, considerably larger than the modest company houses where miners resided. The company was like the air. It was everywhere, in everything, and you couldn't escape it even if you wanted to. Dr. Thornton's home still stands today, though now abandoned, at 17 Looney Ridge Road. Thornton lived there with his wife Eleanor and their housekeeper Martha Sullivan, who commuted daily from Cumberland about 7 miles away. What was the nature of Dr. Thornton's research? Official records from the Kentucky Medical Association mention only that he was studying respiratory conditions common among coal miners. However, entries in Eleanor Thornton's personal diary, recovered in 1952 during a renovation of the house, tell a different story. December 12, 1932. William rarely comes to bed anymore. The sounds from the basement continue through the night. He says it's for the greater good, but I've seen his notebooks. Those aren't medical diagrams any doctor would recognize. December 15, 1932. There was another delivery today, a metal container with government markings. William wouldn't let me near it. I heard him talking to someone on the telephone afterward. "The reaction is more pronounced than we anticipated," he said. "We may need to adjust the dosage." December 24th, 1932. Christmas Eve, and my husband is in the basement with his experiments instead of by my side. When he finally came upstairs, his clothes smelled of something sharp and chemical. There were dark stains on his sleeves. He kissed my cheek, but his lips felt cold. Sometimes I wonder if the man I married is still in there at all. By all accounts, Dr. Thornton was well respected in Lynch. He charged minimal fees and often accepted payment in the form of home-cooked meals or handcrafted items. The company praised his dedication, noting in their quarterly newsletter that illness-related work absences have decreased by 17% since Dr. Thornton's arrival. Yet beneath this veneer of appreciation, there were whispers. Martha Sullivan, in a recorded interview conducted in 1956 by historian Dr. Frederick Jameson of the University of Kentucky, recounted an incident from December 1932. "I was cleaning the study when I found a letter from the mining company's head office in Pittsburgh. It mentioned continuing financial support for your valuable work and maintaining absolute discretion about the experimental procedures. When the doctor caught me with that paper, it was the only time I ever saw him angry. He dismissed me for a week without pay." Sullivan also described changes she had noticed in the doctor over the years. "When he first came to Lynch, he was kind, patient, always asking after my family. But as time went on, something changed in him. He became distant. His eyes would focus on something that wasn't there. And sometimes, when I was cleaning near the basement door, I would hear him talking to himself in a voice that didn't sound quite right, deeper somehow, with an odd rhythm to it." The mining company's records from this period were allegedly destroyed in a fire in 1941, leaving no official trace of this arrangement. However, bank records preserved in the Harlan County Historical Society show monthly deposits of $250, equivalent to approximately $5,000 today, into Dr. Thornton's account from a subsidiary of U.S. Coal and Coke, labeled simply as Research Stipend. A ledger from the company's accounting department, discovered during a 1978 renovation of the former company offices, contains a cryptic entry from November 1932. Project T, $7,500 for specialized equipment and materials. Note, all receipts to be destroyed as per President's instructions. What exactly was happening in that basement? And why did the entire town seem to know something, but say nothing? The week before Dr. Thornton's disappearance was marked by unusual activity. According to train station records, 5 large wooden crates arrived from Johns Hopkins University, addressed to the doctor. The station master, Henry Davis, noted in his log that the doctor insisted on transporting them himself, despite their size and weight, refusing all offers of assistance. Davis later confided to his nephew, who recorded the conversation in 1951, that one of the crates had been damaged in transit. There was a small crack in the wood, Davis reportedly said. "I could see something inside. Glass containers filled with a black liquid that seemed to move on its own, even though the crate was sitting still. When I mentioned it to the doctor, he covered it with his coat and said I must be mistaken, that it was just ordinary medical supplies." That same week, local shopkeeper Evelyn Martin recorded in her sales ledger that Eleanor Thornton purchased an unusual amount of lye, formaldehyde, and salt, enough to preserve several large specimens, as noted by forensic experts who later examined the case. Martin's granddaughter, in an interview for a 1985 oral history project, added a detail not present in the written record. "My grandmother told me that Mrs. Thornton wasn't herself that day. Her hands kept shaking, and she kept looking over her shoulder as if expecting someone to be there. When Grandma asked if everything was all right, Mrs. Thornton whispered, 'He's changing them.' And I think he's changing, too." The town's telephone operator, Gladys Hensley, reported that in the 3 days before his disappearance, Dr. Thornton received calls from the same number in Pittsburgh at precisely 9:15 p.m. each evening. The calls lasted exactly 7 minutes. No records exist of what was discussed. Hensley, however, was known to occasionally listen in on conversations, a common practice among telephone operators of the era. According to her niece, Ruth Parsons, Hensley once confided that she had overheard part of one of these calls. Aunt Gladys said she heard the doctor talking about successful integration at the cellular level and unexpected cognitive side effects. The other person asked if he could control these effects, and the doctor laughed in a way that made her blood run cold. She said it didn't sound like his normal laugh at all. Another notable incident occurred on January 20th, 2 days before the disappearance. According to a report filed by night watchman George Henderson, the lights at the doctor's house remained on all night, and a series of sharp, high-pitched sounds like metal striking metal could be heard coming from the basement until dawn. Henderson approached the house to investigate but stopped when he saw a silhouette in the window that he described as taller than any man should be, with a head that seemed the wrong shape. Sheriff McAllister's initial investigation into the doctor's disappearance was cursory at best. His report, just 3 pages long, concluded that Dr. Thornton had likely left town voluntarily, possibly due to financial troubles or personal matters. No search parties were organized. No alerts were sent to neighboring counties. The case was effectively closed within 48 hours. This conclusion seems particularly suspicious given what was discovered in March of that year. A group of local hunters found what they described as a doctor's bag, all torn up and stained black, near Whisper Stream. Inside were several glass vials containing unidentified powders, a notebook with water-damaged pages, and a pocket watch inscribed with the initials WT. When they brought these items to the sheriff, he reportedly confiscated them immediately. No mention of these items appears in any official report. One of the hunters, Frank Miller, would later become a deputy sheriff himself. In 1963, after several drinks at a local bar, he told a friend about what he had really seen that day. This conversation was overheard by a journalist from the Louisville Courier-Journal who made notes but never published the story due to what he called pressure from above. According to these notes, which were discovered among the journalist's effects after his death in 1992, Miller claimed that the notebook contained writings that made little sense. Formulas, diagrams of human organs with strange modifications, and repeated phrases in what looked like code. More disturbing were the vials, which contained what appeared to be tissue samples suspended in a dark liquid. One of them looked like a piece of lung, Miller allegedly said, but it was wrong somehow, too dark, and with these strange fibers running through it that looked almost metallic. Eleanor Thornton continued to live in the house on Looney Ridge Road for another 6 months after her husband's disappearance. Neighbors reported that she kept all the curtains drawn and was rarely seen in town. Martha Sullivan stopped working at the house, telling anyone who asked that Mrs. Thornton says she prefers to maintain her privacy. A local delivery person, Timothy Reynolds, was one of the few people who had regular contact with Eleanor during this period. In a statement given to Dr. Jameson in 1957, Reynolds, by then a middle-aged banker in Lexington, recalled, "She would never open the door more than a crack to take the groceries. Her hands were always bandaged, and I could hear strange noises from inside, scratching sounds, like something trying to get out. Once I asked if she had a cat. She gave me this look that I still see in nightmares, and said, 'What's in this house isn't anything you'd recognize as an animal.'" In August 1933, Eleanor Thornton sold the house to the mining company for a fraction of its value and moved away, reportedly to stay with relatives in Boston. No forwarding address was recorded, and despite extensive searches conducted decades later by investigators and journalists, no trace of Eleanor Thornton has ever been found after her departure from Lynch. The deed of sale, preserved in county records, contains an unusual clause not typically found in real estate transactions. The buyer acknowledges that certain areas of the property, specifically the basement laboratory, may contain hazardous materials and agrees to take appropriate measures to ensure these are not disturbed or exposed to the public. What happened in those 6 months between the doctor's disappearance and Eleanor's departure. The only clue comes from Reverend Thomas Walker of the Lynch Methodist Church, who mentioned in his personal records that Eleanor stopped attending Sunday services in February, and when he visited to check on her welfare, she spoke to him through a barely opened door. Her face was gaunt, her eyes hollow, he wrote. When I asked if she needed anything, she replied, "Prayers, Reverend. Prayers for those who listen too closely to what comes from the mountain." When I pressed her to explain, she shut the door and would not respond to further knocking. Walker's diary, discovered among church records in 1970, contains a more detailed account of this encounter than he shared publicly. "What disturbed me most," he wrote, "was not Mrs. Thornton's appearance or words, though both were troubling, but what I glimpsed behind her in the hallway. There appeared to be scratch marks on the walls, floor to ceiling, as if made by something with claws, and on the floor was a substance that looked like coal dust, but it moved slightly, even though there was no draft." The Reverend visited once more, in July, just before Eleanor left town. This time she didn't answer the door at all, but he reported hearing a sound like many voices whispering together from within the house. He left a Bible on the doorstep. It was found the next day, its pages blackened as if burned, though there was no sign of fire. The mining company left the house vacant for nearly a year before assigning it to their new company doctor, Alan Richards, who arrived from Philadelphia in September 1934. Dr. Richards and his wife occupied the house for just under 3 months. According to a letter Dr. Richards wrote to his brother, discovered among family papers donated to the Pennsylvania Historical Society in 1967, the couple experienced disturbing phenomena almost immediately upon moving in. "The house seems to resist our presence," he wrote. "Doors that were securely locked are found open in the morning. Items placed on shelves appear across the room. But most troubling are the sounds from the basement, scratching, tapping, what sounds like whispered conversations, despite repeated confirmations that the space is empty." Mrs. Richards, in a separate letter to her sister, described waking one night to find a figure standing at the foot of our bed, shaped like a man, but somehow wrong in its proportions. It seemed to be wearing a doctor's coat, but where its face should have been was only darkness. When I screamed, it dissolved into what looked like particles of coal dust that scattered under the door. By November, Mrs. Richards had returned to Philadelphia, citing health concerns. In her private journal, she noted developing a persistent cough that produced black mucus with strange metallic flecks. Local doctors could find nothing wrong with her lungs, yet the condition persisted until she left Lynch, at which point it cleared up within days. Dr. Richards resigned his position in December, writing to the company that no salary is worth what awaits in that house after dark. The company subsequently demolished the basement, filling it with concrete, before assigning the house to their next physician. A construction worker involved in this renovation, Harold Jenkins, later claimed in a 1959 interview with a paranormal researcher that they found strange modifications in the basement. The walls had been lined with some kind of metal sheeting, he said. There were drains in the floor that led nowhere. They just ended in solid earth. And in the center of the room was a large stone table with straps attached to it like you might use to restrain someone. The company man told us not to talk about what we saw, but some things you can't forget no matter how hard you try. Interestingly, production reports from Mine Number 31 show that in the months following Dr. Thornton's disappearance, coal output increased by nearly 30%, despite employing fewer miners. Company newsletters attributed this to improved worker morale and reduced absenteeism, though no explanation was given for what caused these improvements. Internal company memos, declassified in 1972 as part of a federal investigation into historical labor practices, tell a different story. One report from June 1933 notes, "The men are working longer shifts without complaint or apparent fatigue. Some have gone as long as 36 hours without emerging from the mine. Foremen report that workers sometimes need to be ordered to return to the surface." Another memo from August 1933 raises concerns. While productivity remains at record levels, certain behavioral anomalies have been observed. Workers rarely speak during shifts, even during breaks. They move in unusual synchronicity. Several have been observed standing motionless, pickaxes raised, as if listening to something in the rock. When questioned about these episodes afterward, they claim to have no memory of them. Meanwhile, medical records from the period show a sharp decline in miners reporting respiratory issues or requesting time off due to illness. Dr. Richards noted in a report to the company that the miners seem almost superhuman in their stamina and tolerance for conditions that would fell most men. A visiting physician from the Kentucky Department of Health who conducted routine examinations of miners in October 1933 wrote in his official report, "The pulmonary function of Lynch miners defies medical explanation. Men who have worked in coal dust for decades show lungs clear of the expected accumulation. However, I noted certain physiological abnormalities, elevated body temperature, unusual pupillary response to light, and in several cases, a faint rhythmic tremor in the hands that all subjects denied experiencing." In an unofficial letter to a colleague discovered in 2003, this same physician expressed more personal concerns. There is something wrong in Lynch that goes beyond medical curiosity. The miners submit to examination without complaint, but their eyes seem vacant, observing without truly seeing. When listening to their lungs, I heard something I've never encountered before, a faint sound like whispered words beneath the normal respiratory sounds, and their blood, dark, viscous, with particles that appeared almost crystalline under the microscope. I've sent samples for further analysis, but frankly, James, I find myself reluctant to handle the specimens more than necessary. The mystery of what happened to Dr. Thornton might have remained buried forever if not for an unusual discovery made in 1952. During renovations to expand the Lynch Hospital, workers excavating for a new wing discovered a sealed chamber approximately 15 feet beneath the building's original foundation. According to the foreman's report, the chamber was roughly 10 feet square, lined with copper sheeting, and contained a desk, chair, filing cabinet, and what appeared to be medical equipment. Most disturbing was a leather-bound journal found locked in the desk drawer containing entries written in Dr. Thornton's distinctive handwriting. The final entry was dated January 22, 1933, the day before his reported disappearance. The chamber's existence was not mentioned in any of the hospital's original architectural plans. It appeared to have been constructed secretly, possibly during the original building's construction in 1920, and had no apparent entrance or exit, as if it had been built to be sealed away permanently. The contents of this journal were deemed disturbing and potentially inflammatory by county officials, who ordered it sealed in the county records until 1983. However, a clerk at the records office, Joseph Miller, claimed to have read portions of the journal before it was secured. In an anonymous interview given to the Harlan Daily Enterprise in 1954, he described some of what he saw. The doctor wrote about something he called the breathable solution, a compound he was developing that would allow miners to work longer hours in dust-filled conditions without respiratory damage. He described testing early versions on patients who came to him with minor complaints, without their knowledge. The last pages described plans to introduce the compound into the town's water supply as a large-scale trial. Miller went on to describe the final entries, which took on an increasingly erratic tone. Thornton wrote that he had discovered the compound had unexpected effects beyond protecting the lungs. He claimed it was creating a kind of collective consciousness among test subjects, allowing them to communicate without speaking and to coordinate their actions without explicit direction. In the final entry, dated January 22nd, he wrote, "It is no longer accurate to say that I am administering the compound to the subjects. Something has reversed the relationship. It is communicating through them, and now it is beginning to communicate through me as well. I can hear it in my thoughts, restructuring them. The mountain has been waiting for someone to give it voice, and I have become that conduit. Miller was dismissed from his position shortly after this interview was published, and the newspaper retracted the story a week later, citing factual inaccuracies. Miller reportedly left Harlan County and, like Eleanor Thornton, seemed to disappear completely. The sealed chamber beneath the hospital was filled with concrete, and the renovations continued as planned. The journal was supposedly transferred to state archives in Frankfurt, but researchers who have attempted to locate it in recent decades have been told that no such item exists in their collections. A night watchman at the construction site, Edwin Hawkins, later claimed to a local folklorist that before the chamber was sealed, he entered it against orders out of curiosity. The air inside was heavy, like trying to breathe underwater, he recounted. The walls seemed to pulse slightly as if alive, and there were sounds, not from outside, but emanating from the metal sheeting itself, voices speaking words I couldn't quite make out, but which filled me with a sense of terrible longing. I stayed only minutes, but when I checked my watch after leaving, 3 hours had passed that I couldn't account for. What makes this case particularly disturbing is the collective silence that surrounded it. Despite the unusual circumstances of the doctor's disappearance, the strange behavior of his wife, and the discoveries made years later, few in Lynch were willing to discuss the matter openly. As historian Dr. Jameson noted in his unpublished manuscript, Silences of the Coal Country, 1960, it is as though an unspoken agreement exists among the residents of Lynch to maintain certain secrets. When questioned about Dr. Thornton, even decades after his disappearance, locals either claim ignorance or change the subject with remarkable uniformity. Jameson himself experienced this phenomenon firsthand. During his research in Lynch, he found that scheduled interviews were mysteriously canceled. Recordings of conversations contained inexplicable gaps, and his notes would sometimes be altered overnight while he slept in his hotel room. After 3 months of increasingly disturbing experiences, including what he described as a persistent whispering from the ventilation ducts in his room, Jameson abandoned his research and left Harlan County. He never published his findings, and his manuscript remained unknown until his widow donated his papers to the University of Kentucky Archives in 1981. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of the case comes from company medical records that were declassified in the 1960s. Following Dr. Thornton's disappearance, miners at Lynch began to exhibit unusual characteristics. Productivity increased, as mentioned earlier, but so did certain behavioral changes. Miners who had previously been vocal about poor working conditions became complacent. Men who had been actively involved in unionization efforts suddenly withdrew their support. And most notably, according to hospital records, the miners could work in conditions with dust levels that would normally cause immediate respiratory distress, yet showed no adverse effects. These changes extended beyond the workplace. Church attendance records show a sharp decline after February 1933. Reverend Walker noted in his diary that the adults who did still attend services sit perfectly still, not joining in hymns or prayers, simply staring forward with expressions of calm detachment, as if their minds are elsewhere. When I deliver my sermon, their eyes track my movements with an unsettling uniformity, like predators following prey. Church records also indicate that the usual social functions, potluck dinners, choir practice, community meetings, gradually ceased in the months following the doctor's disappearance. The town seemed to withdraw into itself, becoming increasingly isolated from neighboring communities. Dr. Jameson interviewed several miners who had worked at Lynch during this period. One who requested anonymity told him, "After the doctor left, something changed in all of us. The air in the mine was still bad. You could see the dust floating thick as fog in the lamplight. But it didn't burn our lungs anymore. We could breathe it like clean mountain air. Some nights I'd cough up black phlegm, but by morning I'd feel fine again. It wasn't natural, but none of us questioned it. The pay was good, and times were hard. Another miner was more direct. We knew what the doctor had done. We knew what was in the water. But we needed the work, and the company made it clear that Lynch would be shut down if production didn't improve. So we drank, and we changed, and we kept our mouths shut. This miner, identified only as J.D. in Jameson's notes, added a disturbing postscript. The dream started about a week after the doctor vanished. All was the same. I'm deep in the mountain, but I don't have my body anymore. I'm spread out somehow, flowing through the coal seams like water, feeling every tunnel, every chamber. And I'm not alone. All the other miners are there too, connected. But there's something else with us, something old that's been in the mountain since before there were people. It knows us now. It's learning from us. And sometimes, when I'm deep in the mine alone, I think it speaks through the rocks. It promises things, but I don't think it tells the truth. By 1940, Lynch was producing more coal than any other single mine in Kentucky, despite operating with a workforce approximately 60% the size of comparable operations. A medical examination program instituted by the federal government in 1943 found that Lynch miners had an abnormally low incidence of black lung disease and other respiratory conditions common in the industry. The examining physician, Dr. Harold Cranston, wrote in his report, "The miners of Lynch exhibit pulmonary function far exceeding what would be expected given their working conditions and years of exposure to coal dust. Further study is warranted to determine if some environmental or genetic factor is responsible for this anomaly." What Cranston didn't include in his official report, but confided to a colleague in a recently discovered private letter, was more troubling. Beyond the inexplicable respiratory health, there are other abnormalities I hesitate to detail officially for fear of being thought mad. The miner's skin has a strange luster in certain lights, almost as if embedded with microscopic reflective particles. Their body temperature runs consistently 2 degrees below normal. And during auscultation, I detected what seemed to be secondary rhythmic movements within the chest cavity, operating independently of the cardiopulmonary system. No such study was ever conducted, at least not officially. However, water samples taken from Lynch in 1945 as part of a regional public health survey were flagged for unusual chemical composition. The report noted the presence of unidentified organic compounds in concentrations significantly higher than in neighboring communities. Follow-up testing was recommended, but apparently never carried out. A technician involved in this testing, Edward Collins, later claimed that the samples displayed bizarre properties in the laboratory. Under the microscope, there were structures that didn't match any known microorganism, he told a colleague at a conference in 1957, unaware that his comments were being recorded. They seemed to change form while being observed, reorganizing themselves in patterns that almost resembled written symbols. And the fluid itself, sometimes I could swear it moved on its own, even in sealed containers. The Lynch mine remained productive through the 1940s and into the early 1950s, when changing economic conditions and the increasing mechanization of coal mining led to a gradual reduction in workforce. By 1960, the population of Lynch had declined from its peak of over 10,000 residents to fewer than 4,000. Those who left often reported a difficult adjustment period. A public health study conducted in 1954 found that former Lynch miners who had relocated to other mining communities experienced what one doctor called withdrawal symptoms, insomnia, auditory hallucinations, and a persistent sensation of something missing that many described as similar to phantom limb syndrome. More telling were the reports that came from mining companies that hired former Lynch workers. A manager at a West Virginia operation wrote to U.S. Steel in 1956, "The men from Lynch display excellent technical skills, but problematic social integration. They rarely speak unless necessary, seem to coordinate their activities without verbal communication, and other workers report feeling uneasy around them. Most troubling is their habit of stopping work simultaneously at unpredictable intervals to face the direction of Lynch, Kentucky, often for several minutes. before resuming their tasks as if nothing unusual had occurred. Interestingly, former Lynch residents who moved to other mining communities during this period reportedly showed a gradual return of normal susceptibility to respiratory problems. Those who remained, however, continued to demonstrate unusual resistance to the effects of coal dust exposure. A military document declassified in 1997 reveals that the Department of Defense briefly considered studying Lynch as a potential source for enhancing soldier performance. A 1951 memo from an Army Medical Research Unit states, "The physiological adaptations observed in Lynch miners, enhanced respiratory efficiency, increased stamina, and apparent resistance to pain and fatigue, could have significant applications for military personnel operating in adverse conditions." Of particular interest is the reported ability to function as coordinated units without standard communication. The proposal was ultimately rejected, with a handwritten note in the margin reading, "Potential benefits outweighed by unacceptable risks of psychological effects. See attached reports on behavioral abnormalities. Some things are not worth the cost." In 1963, a graduate student in chemistry at the University of Kentucky, Thomas Reynolds, became interested in the Lynch anomaly while researching regional water quality. He obtained permission to collect samples from various locations around the town, including Whisper Stream and the reservoir that supplied the town's drinking water. His analysis, detailed in his unpublished thesis, identified trace amounts of a compound he couldn't identify, but which shared certain structural similarities with both anesthetic gases and preservative chemicals. Reynolds hypothesized that this compound somehow modified lung tissue to resist irritation from particulate matter. What Reynolds didn't include in his thesis, but confided to his faculty advisor in a recorded conversation, was even more unusual. The compound doesn't just alter tissue, it seems to replace it gradually. Lung cells exposed to the substance begin to incorporate particles that aren't organic in any conventional sense. They're more like crystalline structures with properties of both minerals and living cells. In sufficient concentration, I believe this substance could essentially rebuild a human respiratory system into something, well, not entirely human anymore. Before Reynolds could publish his findings or conduct further research, his laboratory at the university experienced a fire that destroyed his samples and notes. The official investigation concluded that the fire resulted from an electrical fault, though Reynolds himself reportedly believed otherwise. He abandoned his research shortly thereafter and took a position with a pharmaceutical company in New Jersey. In a letter to a former classmate written in 1971 and only discovered after Reynolds's death in 1998, he admitted, "I know what happened in Lynch, what Thornton discovered, and how it changed things. I got too close to understanding it." And that's when the warnings began. Whispers in empty rooms, coal dust forming patterns on my desk overnight, a man in old-fashioned doctor's clothes watching me from across the street but vanishing when approached. After the fire, I received an unmarked envelope containing a single sheet of paper with one sentence, "The mountain prefers its secrets kept." I took the hint. The most disturbing development in the case came in 1967, when construction workers preparing to demolish the old community center in Lynch discovered a hidden room in the basement. According to the construction foreman's statement to local police, the room contained medical equipment, glass containers of preserved specimens, and extensive written records. Before authorities could properly document these findings, unknown persons entered the site overnight and removed everything from the hidden room. When county officials investigated the next day, they found only an empty space with freshly cleaned floors. No fingerprints were recovered, and none of the night watchmen reported seeing or hearing anything unusual. The specimens were never officially identified, but one of the construction workers, Edward Collins, claimed to have looked inside one of the glass containers before the items were removed. In a sworn statement given to the Harlan County Sheriff's Department, Collins said, "It looked like a piece of human lung, but not like any I'd seen before." I served as a medic in Korea. so I know what lung tissue should look like. This was darker, with a strange metallic sheen to it, and there were these thread-like structures throughout, almost like wires growing through the tissue. Collins' statement was taken but never followed up on. 2 weeks after giving his testimony, he accepted a job offer in Cincinnati and left Harlan County. Attempts by later investigators to locate him were unsuccessful. One investigator, a journalist named Robert Anderson, who was researching a book on Appalachian medical history in the 1970s, managed to track Collins to a VA hospital in Ohio in 1975. By then, Collins was suffering from an undiagnosed respiratory condition that had puzzled his doctors for years. They've taken samples, run tests, brought in specialists, Collins told Anderson in their only interview. Nobody can explain why my lungs look the way they do on X-rays. The patterns aren't like any known disease. One doctor said it looked like my bronchial tubes were being replaced by something else, something that branches differently. And the pain, it's not like normal pain. It feels like something is trying to communicate through the nerve endings, sending signals I can't quite interpret. It started right after I handled those specimens in Lynch. Sometimes at night, I hear whispers coming from inside my own chest. Collins died 3 months after this interview. His autopsy report, which Anderson obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request, contains a section that was heavily redacted before release. The visible portions note anomalous structures throughout pulmonary tissue and evidence of progressive replacement of organic material with unidentified crystalline matrices. The cause of death was listed as respiratory failure due to idiopathic pulmonary transformation. By the late 1960s, most of those who had lived in Lynch during the time of Dr. Thornton had either passed away or left the area. The mine itself was in decline, with sections being closed off as coal seams were exhausted. Yet even then, miners who had worked continuously at Lynch since the 1930s showed remarkably low rates of respiratory disease compared to the national average for career coal miners. A study conducted by the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health in 1969 found that these long-term Lynch miners displayed what the report called pulmonary anomalies. Their lung tissue appeared to have adapted to coal dust in ways that medical science couldn't explain. However, these same miners showed higher rates of neurological issues, including tremors, auditory hallucinations, and a phenomenon the researchers termed consciousness synchronization, where multiple subjects would simultaneously report identical thoughts or sensations without external stimuli. Dr. Thornton's research, whatever its exact nature, appears to have had lasting effects. But at what cost? And what really happened to the doctor himself? The most compelling theory comes from a source that only came to light in 1969. A retired miner named Samuel Carter, on his deathbed at the Harlan County Hospital, asked to make a recorded statement in the presence of his minister and a notary public. This recording, preserved in the archives of the Appalachian Oral History Project, provides the only first-hand account of what may have happened to Dr. Thornton. Carter, who was 74 at the time of the recording, claimed to have been part of a small group of miners who confronted Dr. Thornton on the night of January 22, 1933. According to Carter, they had discovered that the doctor had been using them as unwitting test subjects for his respiratory experiments. "We'd been feeling strange for months," Carter said in the recording, "working longer hours without getting tired, breathing easier in the mine. Some men stopped dreaming altogether. Others said they could hear things in the mountain that weren't there, voices coming through the coal seams, telling them to dig here, not there." Carter claimed that they went to the doctor's house that night to demand answers, not intending violence. But when confronted, Thornton allegedly confessed to more than they had suspected. He told us he'd found something in the mountain, something in a deep seam that wasn't coal or rock, something that changed when it came into contact with air. He'd been refining it, testing it on us through our water, said it would make us better miners, more efficient, like we were just machines to be improved. According to Carter, the confrontation escalated when Thornton refused to stop his experiments. He said we didn't understand the importance of his work, that what he'd discovered would change humanity forever. He tried to call someone, his contact at the company, we figured. That's when things got out of hand. Carter's account of what happened next is vague. He claimed that there was a struggle, that the doctor fell and hit his head. There was blood, but he was still breathing when we left. We thought he'd be fine, just shaken up enough to stop what he was doing. But when the miners returned the next day to check on him, the doctor was gone. The house was empty. Not just the doctor, all his papers, his equipment from the basement, everything. Mrs. Thornton was there, sitting in the kitchen, staring at the wall. She looked at us and said, "They came for him in the night. They'll come for all of us eventually." Carter claimed that the miners made a pact never to speak of what happened, fearing they would be blamed for the doctor's disappearance. But that wasn't the end of it, he said in the recording. Whatever the doctor put into the water, it stayed there. And it changed over time, changed us over time. Carter's voice grew weaker at this point in the recording, but his words became more urgent. We started to dream the same dreams, could tell what others were thinking without them speaking. And the mountain, it was like it became aware of us, aware of itself through us. The coal seams weren't just rock anymore, they were more like veins in a body, and we could feel the pulse in them. Some men embraced it, said we were evolving into something better. Others fought it, tried to leave town, but they never got far. Something always brought them back. The most chilling part of Carter's testimony came at the end of the recording. "I'm dying now, but not from black lung, like I should be. The doctors can't explain it. My lungs are clear and healthy. It's something else taking me, something in my brain. I see things that aren't there, hear voices coming from the walls. All of us who worked in Lynch back then, who drank that water for years, we're all going the same way. Our bodies are strong, but our minds are fragmenting." He paused then for nearly a minute before continuing in a voice that the notary public later described as altered, deeper, with an unusual cadence. But that's not quite right. Not fragmenting, merging. We're becoming part of something larger. The doctor understood at the end. That's why he didn't fight when they came for him. He knew he'd discovered not just a compound, but a doorway, and now it's opening wider. Carter died 3 days after making this recording. His official cause of death was listed as natural causes, though his medical records note unexplained neurological symptoms in the months preceding his death. The attending physician, Dr. Elizabeth Moreland, made a private note in her journal, discovered among her papers after her death in 1983, Carter's brain scan showed abnormalities unlike anything in the medical literature. Areas of his cerebral cortex appeared to have reorganized into patterns more reminiscent of mycelium networks than human neural pathways. In his final hours, he spoke in multiple voices simultaneously, carrying on what seemed to be a conversation with himself in different tones and even different languages, some of which didn't sound like any language I've ever heard. Is Carter's account to be believed? It offers a seemingly plausible explanation for the doctor's disappearance, but leaves many questions unanswered. Who were they that allegedly came for the doctor in the night? What exactly had he discovered in the mountain? And perhaps most importantly, what became of his research? Some answers may lie in documents that have yet to be declassified. In 1975, a Freedom of Information Act request, filed by journalist Robert Anderson, sought records related to Dr. Thornton from several federal agencies. The request was largely denied, with the exception of a heavily redacted file from the Department of Energy that confirmed that Dr. Thornton had been involved in a classified research project related to mining efficiency and worker performance. A single unredacted paragraph in this file states, "Subject's research was terminated due to ethical concerns and potential long-term health effects. All materials related to the Thornton formula were confiscated and transferred to secure storage at redacted facility. No further development of this technology is recommended." Anderson pursued the matter further, filing appeals and additional requests that eventually yielded a memo from 1934, written by a federal mining inspector to his superior in Washington. The situation in Lynch has been contained for now, but continued monitoring is essential. Whatever Dr. Thornton introduced into the ecosystem appears to be self-perpetuating and adaptive. The affected miners present no immediate threat as long as they remain isolated, but dissemination of this substance to other mining communities could have unpredictable and potentially catastrophic consequences. A handwritten note at the bottom of this memo adds, "Recommend permanent classification of all materials related to case T33. Some discoveries are best left unexploited, regardless of potential industrial applications." The Lynch mine continued operations until 1971, when U.S. Steel, which had acquired the property, closed it due to declining profitability. In the decades since, Lynch has experienced the same economic struggles as many former coal towns in Appalachia. Its population today is fewer than 600 people. The town's water supply was completely overhauled in 1980 as part of a regional infrastructure project. Testing conducted at that time showed no unusual compounds present, suggesting that whatever Dr. Thornton had introduced to the system had either broken down over time or been deliberately removed. A contractor involved in this project, speaking on condition of anonymity to a local historian in 1992, claimed that the federal government had taken an unusual interest in the Lynch water system renovation. They sent specialists who didn't answer to the regular project managers, he said. These guys would take samples from specific locations they had maps for, locations that didn't make any engineering sense, but seemed to follow some pattern only they understood. They spent a week treating sections of the old pipes with chemicals they wouldn't identify, all while wearing what looked like modified hazmat suits. When I asked what they were looking for, one of them just said, "Containment, not detection." Periodic medical studies of former Lynch miners have continued to show anomalous results, however. A 1983 study by the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health found that miners who had worked at Lynch between 1933 and 1960 had significantly lower rates of respiratory disease than statistical models would predict, but higher rates of neurological disorders, including early-onset dementia and sensory hallucinations. The study's authors noted, there appears to be a trade-off effect in this population, as if respiratory resilience was gained at the expense of neurological stability. The mechanism for this apparent correlation remains unknown. More disturbing were the findings that never made it into the published study, but were described in a letter from the lead researcher to a colleague at Johns Hopkins University. The subject's neurological symptoms display a troubling synchronicity. During our month in Lynch, we documented multiple instances where former miners, now in their 70s and 80s and living in separate care facilities, experienced identical hallucinations at precisely the same time. Most commonly, they reported seeing a tall figure in early 20th century medical attire, observing them from doorways or windows. EEG readings taken during these episodes showed identical wave patterns across all subjects, something that should be statistically impossible. In 1995, the Harlan County Historical Society attempted to conduct a comprehensive investigation into the Thornton case, hoping to finally separate fact from folklore. Their efforts were hampered by the passage of time. Few living witnesses remained, and by the apparent removal of key documents from county archives. Dr. Margaret Wilson, who led the Historical Society's investigation, wrote in her summary report, "At every turn, we found evidence of deliberate obfuscation. Records that should exist do not. Individuals who might have knowledge are deceased or untraceable. It is as if someone has systematically erased Dr. Thornton from history, leaving only enough traces to generate rumors and speculation." Wilson herself experienced unusual phenomena during her research. In her private research journal, which was published after her death in 2009, she described finding coal dust arranged in complex geometric patterns on her notes each morning, despite her office being sealed and alarmed overnight. She reported dreams in which she conversed with Dr. Thornton, who showed her rooms inside the mountain, where men with partly mechanical lungs worked in perfect silence, extracting something far more valuable than coal. Most tellingly, Wilson wrote of receiving an anonymous phone call 2 months into her investigation. The caller, who seemed to be using some kind of voice modulator, said only, "The Thornton matter is closed. The mountain keeps its own. Turn your attention elsewhere, Doctor Wilson, before you attract its interest too deeply." The call was traced to a payphone in Lynch that had been out of service for over a decade. The most recent development in this decades-long mystery occurred in 2009, when demolition began on the old Lynch Hospital building. Workers discovered a small metal box sealed within one of the cornerstone blocks. Inside was a vial containing a black powder and a handwritten note that read simply, "William Thornton's Legacy." According to the lab report, the substance contained organic compounds of unknown origin, possibly degraded by time, and trace elements including rare earth metals not typically found in the region's geology. The technician who performed the analysis, in a conversation with a colleague that was later reported to the Harlan County Historical Society, described more troubling aspects of the sample. Under the electron microscope, we found structures that resembled both crystalline formations and organic cellular material, a hybridization that shouldn't be possible. May God forgive us. The powder was sent to a laboratory for analysis, but results were inconclusive. More disturbing was how the sample behaved during testing. It seemed to react to observation itself, reorganizing its structure when under the microscope, as if aware it was being studied. And there were the equipment malfunctions. Perfectly calibrated machines giving impossible readings, computers crashing and restarting with data altered. What became of the vial and its contents after testing is unknown. Inquiries to local officials have been met with denials that such an item was ever found, despite photographic evidence published in the Harlan Daily Enterprise at the time of discovery. Today, Lynch stands as a shadow of its former self. Many of its buildings are abandoned, slowly being reclaimed by the dense Appalachian forest. Whisper Stream still flows where it always has, though few remember why it earned that name. The site where the Thornton house once stood is now an empty lot, overgrown with brambles and mountain laurel. Yet among the older residents there remains a reluctance to discuss certain subjects, ask about Dr. Thornton, and conversations quickly turn to other topics. Mention respiratory experiments or strange compounds in the water, and you'll likely be met with silent stares or abrupt departures. In the nearby town of Benham, just 2 miles from Lynch, resides perhaps the last person with direct connection to the case. Margaret Sullivan, 93, is the daughter of Martha Sullivan, who worked as the Thorntons' housekeeper. Though her memory is fragmented by age, she recalls stories her mother told about the doctor and his work. Mother would come home smelling of strange chemicals, Sullivan said in a 2015 interview. She'd wash her hands until they were raw, but said she could still feel something on them. She told me once that the doctor had found something he called mountain breath, something that lived deep in the earth and changed when it touched air. Said he was trying to tame it, to make it help people rather than harm them. When asked what became of Dr. Thornton, Sullivan's response was cryptic. Mother said he became part of his own experiment in the end, that the mountain took him back. That's all she would ever say about it. Is there any truth to this explanation, or is it merely the folkloric transformation of events too disturbing to relate directly? Like much of this case, we may never know with certainty. What we do know is that something unusual occurred in Lynch, Kentucky in the early 1930s. A doctor disappeared. A community changed. Men who should have suffered from breathing coal dust for decades somehow did not. And throughout it all, a conspiracy of silence has obscured whatever truth might exist. Perhaps the real horror of the Thornton case lies not in what we know, but in what remains hidden, in the spaces between documented facts, in the redacted portions of government files, in the minds of those who lived through those times but chose to remain silent. As Samuel Carter said in his final recorded statement, Some things should stay buried in the mountain. Some secrets belong to the earth, not to men. What the doctor found, what he did with it, that knowledge comes with a price none of us understood until it was too late. The mines of Lynch are closed now, their tunnels either collapsed or flooded. Whatever secrets they held are likely lost forever. Yet occasionally hikers in the area around Looney Ridge report hearing sounds that shouldn't be there. Whispered conversations with no visible source, the rhythmic tapping of metal on stone coming from solid rock, the distant sound of men working in mines that have been abandoned for half a century. And sometimes, though rarely, they report seeing a solitary figure, a man in early 20th century clothing carrying a doctor's bag, moving purposefully through the forest toward the sealed entrances of mine number 31. By the time they reach the spot where the figure was seen, there is never anyone there. Just the mountain, breathing silently, keeping its secrets for another day.